Good afternoon, evening, everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion for our exhibition, No Place Like Home, a Vietnamese exhibition. My name is KV Duong. I am the co-curator along with Owen Hewitson. And together we are 8 artists from the Vietnamese diaspora. Minh Lan Tran, AP Nguyen, Zong Thuy Nguyen, that collaboration between Qua Pham and Owen Hewitson, Gong Pham, who is the sound installation artist, and Karen Gervais, who did the photo albums. We'd like to thank the Museum of the Home for hosting us, and Derwent Arts and Arts Council of England for funding this exhibition. I'm very pleased to welcome our panelists today. Annabelle Wilkins, researcher from Kingston University, London, and author of Migration, Work and Home, Making in the City, Dwelling and Belonging Amongst Vietnamese Communities in London. So Hoa and I read your book extensively and discussed extensively for preparation of this exhibition. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
Gong Pham, artist and co-founder of the Viet Archive Steering Committee, and will speak about the legacy of the Viet Foundation as the home for the Vietnamese diaspora in London. Dora Lam, artist in residence for uncovering Vietnamese archives at the Museum of the Home. Dora, along with some creatives, ran some workshops over the last few months here with engaging with the East and Southeast Asian diaspora. I'm excited to hear your reflections of that very fruitful and, I guess, emotional experience. And Owen Hewitson, PhD in psychoanalysis, practicing psychotherapist at the Guild of Psychotherapists with an interest in trauma study in a Lacanian orientation. So the format of the panel discussion today is I'm going to ask the panelists a series of 3 questions. They'll have a chance to respond. We'll have an opportunity to ask each other questions, and then we'll open up the floor for the audience to ask questions. I'm really excited to be here because I want to learn from the panelists, equally from the audience because there are a lot of experienced people here, so thank you for your engagement in advance and ask us questions afterwards. The 3 questions that we are discussing today are: what does home mean for the Vietnamese diaspora community in the UK? How are cultural conflicts negotiated within the diasporic community? And what objects create a feeling of home for us? So the first question, what does home mean for the Vietnamese diaspora community in the UK? Just to say that Vietnam endured a prolonged warfare in the 20th century. So the concept of home, in addition to the physical dwelling that we live in, it is also a mental construct for the diaspora community that has moved many cities and countries. I'd like to take an opportunity to explain the curation concept of this exhibition. So welcome to our home. In Britain, when you're saying hello to someone, you would ask, how is the weather? In North America, you would ask, how are you? And in the Vietnamese community and in the East Southeast Asian community, it's common to ask, have you eaten? I know I do that with my parents when I Skype home. And within the context of the Vietnamese history, where there has been periods of prolonged war, and then after the Vietnam War, there are periods of rationing, asking someone, have you eaten, means, are you well nourished? Are you fed? So that is the concept of this exhibition here. You can see that we've curated these low curved tables to decolonize the way one views art in the community in a museum context. These objects that you see on the table, it is a collaborative effort of our artist team bringing our gifts or our food to the dinner party, and everyone here is invited as a guest to our dinner party. And I think during meal exchange in our community, it's very informal. It is our way to share memories and pass on knowledge between the generations. So we'll start off the question for Annabelle. Perhaps you can start by giving us a context of the Vietnamese immigration history within the UK and your reflections of the research that you did.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to start by saying thank you to KV and all the artists and everyone involved in curating this exhibition for inviting me to be here. I feel very honoured to be here alongside everybody. So to give some context to my involvement, I did a PhD working with the Museum of the Home I finished in 2016-17, looking at the experiences of people from Vietnam, some of whom arrived as refugees, some of whom arrived more recently because they came for work or education. And I did interviews with people about their experiences of home and work, and looked at the relationships between those topics, and also how people experienced those things more broadly in the context of migration. And in terms of the history of the Vietnamese community in the UK, I'm sure most people, if not everyone here, is very well informed about that, but just in case anyone isn't, most people within the Vietnamese community started arriving in the 1970s and 1980s. So after 1975, there was a massive exodus of people from Vietnam who fled at the culmination of the conflict, sometimes called the American War, and many of them were resettled in third countries, including the US and elsewhere, places in Europe. The UK at first was quite reluctant, I would say. The government was quite reluctant to accept people from Vietnam, but because Hong Kong was a British colony at the time, the first people to be accepted were 10,000 refugees who were in refugee camps in Hong Kong. That was followed by other series of arrivals, including family reunion and other programs, which meant that by the 1980s, the late 1980s, there were around 22,000 people from Vietnam here in the UK. To return to the exhibition, I think all the connections that I see, that I saw straight away is this kind of look at the ambivalence of home, and that's something I'm really interested in my research, and I think that comes through so strongly, just the kind of difficulty that people had establishing any kind of home when they first arrived in the UK, that just because they'd been resettled, it was not everyday kind of homemaking was definitely very difficult. There were huge difficulties with housing in London and other cities where people were living, and there was also a policy of dispersing refugees around the country at the time, which made it very difficult for people to settle or establish any sense of community. Many people migrated for a second time within the UK, and they came to London and other cities to try to draw on those forms of support. And refugee-led organisations were established, which actually helped people to find housing and work, and kind of develop a sense of community here. So that, I would say, is the kind of first context. I don't know how much detail to go into at this point, but
yeah, in your interview with the people who moved here, what notions of home or what objects, so we'll discuss objects later, but just the concept of home, what did you grasp with them? How long did it take them to settle down, or if they settled down at all? What went through their heads?
So I think, as you said, the concept of home itself is very contested. So I think for many people, when they first arrived, if they came as refugees, it was about kind of survival almost, and building those first, securing an income, securing a house, securing work. So many people actually turned to making clothes in their home because that was a form of work that, for people who had language difficulties, they didn't require much English, and so that enabled, in one way, people to start building a life here. But in terms of the longer term, if we want to say a sense of home or belonging, I think that stayed a challenge, a difficulty for something that people wrestled with for a long time. I think for some people I spoke to, it was memories of their former home in Vietnam that remained very important, and they kept drawing on those, but that was also emotionally very difficult relationship. Other people started to look to the future, and maybe once they'd established their own families in London or wherever they were living, that became a sense of more rootedness and feeling more connected to the local Vietnamese community, or even London as a city. For some people, they felt more at home in relation to the city perhaps than the country. They didn't maybe feel a sense of belonging in the country, but yeah, so I think there were different connections to home, different forms of home, and those again come through very strongly in terms of what's been explored in this exhibition, the different scales that home is felt at and how it changes over time, I think.
We'll pause for a moment and ask Duong to speak about the legacy of the An Viet Foundation and explain to the audience what this venue meant and what services they offered to the Vietnamese community.
Yeah, and thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you all for coming. I think with Andy, I'll maybe talk about it with the other questions. But in terms of how home is, how the Vietnamese diaspora define home, I've got sort of 4 categories, I think, we can define home, and it's through loss. So the first form of loss that's related to home is one which Annabelle talked about, is the loss of country. So you don't mind me using you as an example, KV. KV was born in Vietnam, and he left when he was 6. He came to Canada when he was 6, and so he had to leave this country. It's a movement from one place to another. And in this particular case, Vietnam no longer exists. It's South Vietnam, or is known as the Republic of Vietnam. And then we have a second form of loss. For those who then return to a place of which you used to call home, it no longer is the same place, right? Because time has changed the place. People move on, people grow up, they have children, they have jobs, and you no longer become what I see as a witness to the city, right? The witness to the changes, the people, the traffic, what's going on. You become a visitor. And that can be quite difficult. Then the third loss, my mind's gone blank for something. Loss is third loss, it was, yes it is. I tried to forget it because I had an argument on the bus. And this is where my mind was, okay, yes. So a couple of weeks ago I had this argument on the bus with an old lady. She told me off because of my son, right? And then, fine, we had this argument, I ignored her, and I tried to get on with my bus ride. But I can hear in the background her talking about me, right? And she's using these very exclusive pronouns, and she's using these words we and they, right? And not all diaspora experience the first 2 loss, but the third one, I think all will, right? No matter how we look, no matter how long we've been here, no matter your experiences or your education, you'll always be reminded you're not from here, right? It's whether the way you look or your accent. And no matter how hard you try and prove it, there will always be people who try and demarcate you from their world, right? And so in this particular instance, this woman was using a very subtle but slightly aggressive ways of we and they to say, I'm not part of her imagined community, right? In the words of Benedict Anderson. And then the fourth form of loss, I think this might be, I need to be careful how I say it because I don't want to be judgmental. And I would also welcome comments and people's experiences is loss of transmission through language. And so to continue the autobiographical theme of being a parent, so when I became a parent in 2020, my partner, who's a linguist, and she's from Vietnam, we decided that we were going to do the one parent, one language method. Right? So one of us would speak Vietnamese and one would speak English. She chose Vietnamese, and then so naturally I did English, as I parented in English. And we did this for maybe the first year. And then when my mother-in-law came the second time round, when my son was about 1, I mean, all parents would know we've got parents here, in the first year they don't really do much. They do a lot of like walking around, they don't talk, right? It's just when they become 1, they start talking and they start responding, and they start learning words. And my mother-in-law doesn't speak English, so for practical sense, I switched to Vietnamese instead of me repeating things twice, right? So instead of me saying dinner's ready, have you eaten yet, I'm going chill, I didn't have to say it twice, I said it once, right? And just excuse me, I've got a little quote which I read the other day, and this is where the idea came from. It's a quote by Phạm Quỳnh, who is a literary critic, and he was prominent in the interwar years, particularly in between World War I and World War II, where the Vietnamese intellectuals were really asking the big questions about nationhood, about nationalism, what it meant to be Vietnamese, about language. Phạm Quỳnh in particular was a Mandarin, so he would have known classical Chinese, so literary Chinese, vernacular Vietnamese, so spoken Vietnamese, and then French. I put my phone away, I haven't read the quote. Yeah, no, I haven't read. So the quote, I'm going to change the genders because so Phạm Quỳnh warned, in borrowing someone else's language, you are also borrowing his ideas, literary techniques, even his emotions and customs. Sorry, I should have changed the gender, but what I think Phạm Quỳnh was saying at the time when the idea of Vietnam hadn't existed, they were really debating what language should we use and what language should we write in. Right? And what Phạm Quỳnh is saying here is, by speaking French, by learning French, you're borrowing other ideas. And so, I know it sounds quite ridiculous sometimes to compare like these big questions and then being a parent that I'm borrowing somebody else's ideas. But what I found was when I switched to Vietnamese, because I'd grown up speaking to my parents in Vietnamese and like young people in Vietnamese, it felt really natural to me, rather than I'm borrowing somebody else's way of parenting, borrowing somebody else's way of speaking about compassion and love and comfort. I was using what the language my parents were for teaching me, and at the same time my partner was using the same language as well, of which she was taught. So you get this sort of intergenerational care, right? And so I'm going to give you a very small example. So the words I love you, right? They're very 3 little words, and at the end you've got I and you, which are quite universal, and you can kind of swish them around, right? You can say I love you to a parent, to a romantic partner, to a friend, and it doesn't change. Whereas anybody who speaks Vietnamese, the pronouns, and generally speaking East Asian languages, are quasi-family. So you can switch, you have to switch pronouns according to how you are related to the person, right? So if you are related to the person, that person's your parent, you would say, God, you're there. Son loves mother. If it's a romantic partner, you also switch it. But then this middle word, love, right? Love, there's 2 words in love in Vietnamese. And there's yêu, right, which is a positive, it can be romantic, it can be passionate, but it's joyful and happiness, love, right? And then you have the other word, tuong. Tuong is a slightly different word, right? And it can form compound words within like tuong hai, vết thương, injury, words that are more associated with trauma, more associated with heartrending, more associated with sadness. And it's in those contexts where there's a slight shift in your relationship to that person. So in this particular case, you would say tuong in a situation where you want this person to be compassionate to you, to have some sympathy. And these are the types of things that it's very hard to kind of learning books or TV shows or pop songs, right? It's through experience that you get this. And so that last one is through loss of transmission.
Thank you, Gun. I think we'll touch upon that on our second question about cultural hybridity and the cultural conflicts. Dora, I'd love to hear your experience of the archive residency and how you reflect upon the meaning of home.
Yeah, so it's a subject that
I think first, sorry, explain to the audience, just a brief, what the residency was.
Yeah, thanks again for inviting me, and thanks everyone for being here. I recently completed the Uncovering Vietnamese Archives residency here at the Museum of the Home, and the idea was to create this space where the Vietnamese community can engage with archives in a deep and meaningful way. And that turned into a series of 5 workshops. And over the series of these workshops, I worked with Going and Caro and a few other practitioners, and we focused on different areas. But overall, the idea was to kind of take a critical look at archives and what's represented out there of the Vietnamese community, and really engage with the absence of just the general absence, what we find is missing, or the voices that we think are missing. So the series of workshops, we covered photography, we covered personal objects, we worked with sound, and what are the other ones now? I've forgotten. Oh, we took a visit to Hackney Archives as well as the first session, which Gun kindly led, and there was also a craft workshop where we did some bamboo weaving. So it was through various different methods that we kind of reactivated the archives. And of course, as always with these kinds of workshops, and because we're operating in diaspora communities, the question of home and the question of identities always comes up, and the two are just intrinsically linked. So I think, home is a representation of your identity in a way. It's how you perceive the world, and what, the world that you create for yourself is home. And so really, for the first question, I don't think there is really a simple answer for what is home. And I can speak from my experience as a British-born Chinese person, and I can speak nearby to what I've learned through the workshops and just through engaging with the Vietnamese community. But I think overall, home is more, it's an unfixed thing, particularly if I'm speaking to, I think, the third version of loss that Gung was speaking to, which is that, there isn't this, it's this undefinable thing. It can be completely transient, and it can be changing as well over time. And the feeling of home can also be really fleeting. It could just be a sensation that you get from a sound, and it's gone in a second. And so I think and then it can range to a really basic idea of home, like it's just where my bed is, it's where the kitchen is, where there's a kitchen. And I think Annabelle touched on this earlier as well. Often, a lot of migration stories, they're based on families who migrated because they had to. So anything that is above the need for survival is a luxury. So then it's all, the objects that we're going to talk about later, they tend to be quite functional things. So it's such a sprawling, home is such a sprawling, undefinable thing, that I can never give a good answer to it, really. And I've probably rambled on, but...
If we speak about community building, because you ran about 4 to 5 workshops, and there have been repeat visitors, so you can see even within the guest of 20 people, friendships have been born from this. Do you see, just from the interaction along the series of the workshops, anything that surprised you in terms of stories that people shared? I know that there was one guest who never really engaged with their Vietnamese community or culture until this access point came, and then
Yeah.
she opened up and then engaged with a lot and opened up her life story.
Yeah, I think that this is the thing. I think everybody who attended the workshops came because they had some desire for to preserve their stories somehow, and we did that through sharing and listening, essentially. And the workshops all were a site for that. And I think actually, you know, a home is also like a memory palace. It's like a site to relive and to recreate memories constantly. And you know, touching on what you said, the workshops became a site for that as well, where people are sharing those memories. And it felt very rare that there was an opportunity to do that within the community, which I'm always surprised by, because when I boil it down, it's like we just needed a space, and it happened. And you know, just the fact that the people who tend to attend these workshops are people who are actively engaged in wanting, in this desire to do that, that it just very naturally happens. Yeah.
Thank you, Dora. And Owen, how do you reflect on what you guys have said so far?
I mean, I think it's very interesting speaking from a psychoanalytic perspective of these efforts to kind of forge an identity or to create something that might give someone a sense of identity, like the sense of home, because that's obviously one of the tasks that psychoanalysis is trying to undertake with people who might come into psychotherapy, for instance. And one of the kind of guiding principles, at least in Lacanian psychoanalysis, the kind that I practice, is that the subject is never really, the person is never really opaque to themselves. So someone's sense of themselves, which is perhaps how we might define identity, always has to be questioned and interrogated, perhaps in a very progressive, long drawn out way in the process of a psychoanalysis. And one of the things that you tend to find is that someone's sense of self is not really founded on the degree to which they might correspond to a particular nationality or particular culture, but more in terms of the points in their life that have created a rupture or discontinuity, something that has broken a pattern, something that has broken a chain. So when you talk, for instance, about a sense of home coming from a smell or a noise or something that is discontinuous, this is very close to what it seems the psyche does when it's trying to negotiate these problems of how to fit one's identity into a kind of a cultural matrix. Usually it's at those points of ruptures, because rather than there being a kind of a narrative that you fit into, it's much more a case of these points come up, these unassimilable points come up, and they have to be configured or represented somehow, or put into words or images, and that's a very difficult, painful process. Usually what the psyche does is it tends instead not to represent things through narratives or through stories, but much more in terms of inscriptions, in a much more minimal fashion. So instead of having a kind of a fantasy, the standard psychoanalytic reading is sometimes you have these kind of fantasies or scenarios of your life and then you make art out of them. A lot of psychoanalysts, myself included, believe that actually it's the reverse. There are these points of discontinuities and ruptures, and art comes out of that. If you think of a potter making pottery on a wheel, they're not making something out of the clay itself, they're making something out of the gap, the void, the hole, the central lack that forms around it. And that's very much an idea, one of the core ideas in psychoanalysis of how identity is formed through these kind of minimal inscriptions that the psyche fixes on sounds, voices, tastes that don't often have body or visual representation. So I mean, thinking of some of the works in front of us here, they're not simply objects. Like they may represent something of home, like the birthday cake or the durian here, or in the formaldehyde here, but these are things that can't be assimilated in some way. Right? That durian can't be eaten, the birthday cake is partially made of concrete or plaster, or these things there's always some kind of residue that can't be metabolized, and that's very often, especially in cases of trauma, what you tend to find people trying to work through. So this here has a kind of a visual bodily form.
There's so much to unpack here, and I think we'll go to the second question, and then we'll have more opportunity because probably some of the points will overlap with each other. How are cultural conflicts negotiated within the diasporic community? And I'd like to bring up the theorist Homi Bhabha's concept of the third space and hybridity within the context of colonialism. So he says that hybridity refers to the merger of different cultural influences to create new and complex forms of identity. So it's not simply merging cultures, there's an internal conflict for the person who's being colonized of what part of your culture to give up and which part of the colonizer's culture to merge. If we think of the Vietnamese language, the modern Vietnamese language, Vietnam was colonized by China and then France. Within the text, there's still a lot of borrowed loan words from the Chinese dialect in the sound. And if you think of the alphabet, the Latin alphabet of the Vietnamese language, and that was developed during the French colonialism. So it's not a coincidence that both Vietnamese and French has the accents. So think of myself as an ethnically Chinese person who was born in Vietnam. We weren't well off, but my parents hired a private tutor to come to our house to teach my siblings and I Vietnamese and Cantonese. And I thought that was quite normal, and it wasn't until as an adult I understood that because he felt the conflict or discrimination even within Saigon, within the Vietnamese community, he didn't want us to be picked upon by the other Vietnamese children. And if we think about the artist team's background, we have three who were born and raised in Vietnam and came to the UK for school. So AP, Qua, and Zung. And then we have three artists from the French National, Hoa Dung, Carol, and Minh Lan. Minh Lan was born in Hong Kong and Carol to mixed race parents. And then Duong, who was born in London to parents who were both refugees to Hong Kong. And myself, born in Vietnam, but then grew up in Canada and now the UK. So even within the context of the 8 artists here, there is so much context, contested history that we have to navigate through. So I'll ask this question first to Duong, and I think even when you discussed about the quarrel with the bus lady, and also how you navigate raising your child here.
Yeah, thank you for asking me. I also want to talk about Ambit Archives. For those who don't know Ambit, let's give it kind of a short background. Ambit Foundation was based here in Hackney, just up on Englefield Road. So you've got along Kingsland Road, and it sits there. And it was a refugee centre, and it helped with settlement in the UK. And that's a short synopsis of what it did. And in 2017, it closed. And so that shifted from a refugee centre towards an archive. And we spent some time there. KV, Hua came, Caro came, and I think a few other people came as well. We spent 1-2 sessions there having a look through it. But there's one particular letter that stands out to me, and this talks to the conflict and talks to the adaptation that you talked about, right? And how when things move, things have to adapt. There's a letter from a Hackney councillor, and he wrote to Vu Keng Tang, the former director, who's passed away, and warned him that the South Vietnamese flag cannot be flown and the South Vietnamese anthem cannot be played. Right? And this is in stark contrast to the US, where these two symbols of nationalism are incredibly celebrated. So, in doing so, Vu Keng Tang was a staunch anti-communist. He wanted to still have elements and traces of this through his work. So if you see like the symbolism and the logos and the flags that he designed or asked people to design, he'd weave these images in. into the fabric of Ambit Foundation. And that got me thinking, how does one adapt, right? How does one adapt what they believe in politically, or what memories they have, into their own practice? And when I was doing this work here, regenerative mediations, one of the things that also came out of our conversations was that home was actually not always a happy place. Like it may have started as a happy place when you're children, but when life gets in the way, when jobs get in the way and pressures get in the way, things change. And I especially noticed it sonically. We spoke about, particularly in my case, I won't say what other artists had also found in common, was that there was a lot of arguments in my household, right? And this really shifts that relationship you have to the house. And beside that, I came across this piece of research that had two hypotheses. That posits that within coral reef systems, when little coral larvae, they spawn, we tend to think of them as plants, but if we think of them as animals, they then float around the sea until they find something sonically pleasing, right? And then they choose to live there for the rest of their lives. And then there's a second hypothesis that posits that, so you get healthy coral reef systems and you get unhealthy. Let's go with this binary for now. If you record healthy coral reef systems and play them in an unhealthy ones, can it regenerate the ones that have been degraded? And at the moment they think yes. And so this is one of the questions that I had, right? So combining it with the national anthem, the warning about the national anthem that we had in the Ambit archive, and how that has been adapted, and then means of using sound to regenerate, that's what I did here. And so I got a lot of the artists to send in recordings. So KV sent something, AP sent a recording of her trying Bangzan. Duong sent some videos of her younger nieces singing. Carol sent something as well, and I did a couple of recordings. And I didn't want to play them as they were. I needed to distort them, reverb them, echo them. And in some cases, for instance, like AP's recording, I slowed it down where it can almost become unrecognizable. And that speaks to the way Bukang Tang had kind of manipulated and stretched his symbols of South Vietnam to adapt to what was going on here. That's how I saw cultural conflicts, and it speaks to kind of when things kind of move to one place to another, especially in the context of colonialism, as how things can be adapted.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's very interesting to correlate people's experience with that of nature, and I think there are many similarities that we can reflect from. Annabelle, would you like to give any of your thoughts?
Thank you. Yeah, so obviously, like as an outsider position, this was something that was quite difficult for me to, I guess, understand, and also people were, I guess, understandably, I think, quite wary of discussing things like that with me. And I think I came to the research probably like much too naive about how important such conflicts could be and how they would shape the experience of home, and how much work I needed to do to read about those conflicts as much as I could, and also be as sensitive as I could be to, you know, what people wanted to talk about. So I, you know, experienced some resistance about some questions, and it was up to me to, I guess, go away and think about, okay, why is that question relating to home difficult? And, you know, I think there's a lot of research that needs to be done about the politics of refusal in some cases for people to, you know, refuse to engage with some questions because perhaps of emotional trauma, or because it's just, yeah, it's not appropriate for someone who's perhaps outside of the community to engage or to ask about those questions. And so but what I did learn, both from interviews and from archive research, is, I guess, the importance of like linguistic and cultural diversity and how those really played out in people's early experiences of resettlement as well as more recent ones. So as an example, in some archive research I was doing about how people were supported in the reception camps, which were often former military bases. There was a lot of assumptions that people spoke the same language, and people who didn't speak Vietnamese often didn't have as much access to language support in the camps, and interpreters who were present in the camps were often ended up being responsible for all sorts of different forms of support that in many cases they weren't trained to provide, and that led to a lot of kind of fallouts and difficulties for people who were arriving in the camps. In the interviews with people that I did, some of them did speak about the influence of like pre-existing divisions between, say, people who originally come from North Vietnam and people from South Vietnam, and how those divisions were still influencing kind of community relations at that time, sometimes making it difficult for different organisations to work together. And so I think, I guess how those conflicts are transmitted or still keep affecting community relationships is also important. But I think that as a researcher, I guess what I hope to do is amplify the experiences of what people choose to share with me. And something that I've also maybe wanted to reflect on is over the course of my research, I think I've also seen a real increase in solidarity between perhaps different communities, whether that's communities from Southeast Asian heritage and movements, perhaps of pro-migration movements supporting refugees in the context of the hostile environment. And I think that's something that's really been excellent to see those movements develop and work with each other and kind of maybe overcome not all of those differences, but kind of start to have a dialogue about them and how different groups can work together on those issues.
So in addition to the Vietnamese people confronting with their new Western culture, they're also contesting with each other between the North and South division. Dora?
I just wanted to add that, as a diaspora existing within the dominant Western culture, and just speaking directly to the experience of the workshops, there was maybe another form of loss I wanted to touch upon. Maybe it's related to the fourth one you talked about, but it's anticipatory loss. I think that these workshops were wonderful because it brought together multiple generations of the community. There were older people who turned up who are actually writing memoirs about their stories and their journeys here. And then there were perhaps like the middle group, people who are raising families here, and often they're in mixed race couples, and raising children with like these kind of tricky situations with language and loss of language. And then there's the younger generation who, just because of these contemporary narratives that are going on, they're seeking to locate themselves within a culture, which is what we're doing here. But I think across all the groups, and whether perhaps they know it or not, I think there is this idea that they're kind of grappling with this idea of anticipatory loss, because as time goes on and as families move and as geographies change, there's this fear that that a culture their own culture is being diluted or being misinterpreted or just dissolved. And that would happen if you find yourself within a dominant Western culture, particularly in one with a history of colonialisation and one with issues of representation. So within the workshops, we kind of tried to address that by giving space to microhistories, and I call them microhistories. They may not be the same definition that people use in academia. But for me, microhistories are these misbehaving slices of history which don't find a home within mainstream history. They misbehave, they refuse to be categorized, they're impossible to date, they can appear in fleeting moments and then disappear. They're almost impossible to document truly. So the workshops, I wanted the workshops to become a space for those to come to the surface. And then the exhibition, which evolved over the series of the workshops, it's deliberately quite bare in physical things and explanations, because I think it's a very sacred thing that these conversations and these histories were shared within this very sacred space, and I think it's important that those histories cannot be they cannot be stolen once they've been shared. They exist in some kind of time space for the people who experienced that workshop, and they can never be reconstructed. So that's how I was trying to address that particular conflict.
I have a question for both Duong and Dora, who are second generation people here. I know, Duong, you're relearning Vietnamese as an adult. And Carol, I'm not sure what your diction of the Chinese language is. And now you're raising kids. How important is it for them to learn their mother, I don't know how to describe it, I don't know if it's the mother tongue, but English, but also then Vietnamese and Chinese? How do you navigate that?
I think we need to be careful, because not all families can learn their mother tongue. I have a friend whose mum lived in the 70s in San Francisco, but it's still incredibly racist. In Chinatown as well, and they had signs in her school that said no Chinese, right? In a Chinese school that said no Chinese. So I think we need to be careful of that. We shouldn't be judgmental, first of all. And not everybody has the time, and sometimes language can be traumatic. And I'm quite fortunate because my partner speaks very good Vietnamese, and she teaches Vietnamese. And then I've put out the time to learn it. But for me, it felt important because it was natural. I mean, it's things you say to babies that you don't say to adults, right? You know, you say really cute things to them, right? I wouldn't say it to you. And do you know what? Disclaimer, I don't want to say this in public in English. I don't want to, talk about my son's little toy. So I can say these things to him in Vietnamese, and other parents won't hear me. And so we can kind of disappear a bit inside. It's also important because it's so natural for me, because I've spoken to children all in Vietnamese. I will talk to other people's children in Vietnamese sometimes, and that's what I feel. And I used to think, actually, I actually changed this the last few days. I used to think English was my most proficient language. I think it is in certain contexts. In a context like today, it is. Whereas in the family, my Vietnamese is the most proficient. It's that love, it's that language of love and care, which I've learned. So it was important for me because I needed to use a way to communicate that care to my son.
And how about teaching your son? Do you have expectations of him to read and write both languages?
I hope so. Otherwise he can leave the house.
Dora, how do you navigate this?
Language is such a huge topic. It came up so much as well in workshops. But from my personal experience, it was very important to me to speak Cantonese with my son. He's just a year and a half. And speaking Cantonese is something that I associated with just my family. So it was very important to this sense of home. And I think for a lot of people, even for people who can't speak the language, just hearing the language is also, it's this kind of accidental feeling of home then suddenly. It's this, I've actually found that engaging with the language every day, which was a completely unnatural thing for me because I didn't speak to my parents. I don't speak to my parents every day. And I don't speak Cantonese all day in my own home. So now that I do, it's become this new way of being for me. And actually my Cantonese has improved so much. It's incredible.
That's a life hack. You have to read stories to your children in Cantonese or Vietnamese, so you read really simple stories.
Yeah.
It's a great way of learning yourself.
Yeah.
Oh, and children aren't judgmental. Adults are so judgmental. Children don't care.
Not the people here.
No.
Owen?
Yeah, I mean, the question of like language and the register of the voice and translation, I mean, these are really interesting questions because, you know, thinking about some of the works here, they are works that corrupt language, that corrupt a text, that render it untranslatable, like the Geneva Accords that KV has superimposed on top of one another. You know, these are obviously very meaningful texts, but can only be understood later, and therefore the kind of superimposition of one on the other renders them meaningless in the same way as perhaps it might explain or not explain something about the meaninglessness of the history behind them. And indeed your works, you know, that use the register of the voice, you know, they are speakers, those things transmit a message, but you don't have the choice as to whether you hear it or not, right? There is always that invocation, there's, by the fact of a loudspeaker being there, it's like there's the register of the voice, but minus the effect of meaning. As you said, there's an effort to kind of distort and corrupt that medium. So there's, you know, it's very simple to think that sometimes you can just sort of get people to say things or write them down or, you know, even learn another language. But I think if there's a psychoanalytic point here, it's that we're not really at home in our own language, because the words that we might use would mean more than we mean in using them, right? The meaning is excessive, it goes beyond our conscious intent, and that's part of the whole process of psychoanalysis and free association and allowing people to form thoughts that they haven't thought before. This is what we call the unconscious.
I think, you know, calling myself an artist from the Vietnamese diaspora, I speak Cantonese to my family. I understand Vietnamese to a 7-year-old, and I dream in English. So how does one grasp that? And I think all the artists here have that conflict of how you identify yourself. And it took me a long time to have conviction to say that I am an artist who responds to the Vietnamese history, my parents' history, and it has shaped the way that I speak, that I act, that I think. And it's important to note that our experience as multinational people is as valid as someone who was born, I would say Vietnam as an example, and who grew up there. They're different experience, but they're both notable Vietnamese experiences. For the last question, what objects create a feeling of home for us? I just want to take a chance to go through some of the artworks we have on display. So this durian here, by Hoa Dung and Hoa Pham, it's called The Gift, and for them it is the gift of friendship and conversations that they've had over the months, and it is a residue of the gift for the audience, which is the premise of all of the objects here actually, because although other than the stool installation and the durian, all of the other works were done individually, we bounced off ideas with each other. We were having our own group crits of how to respond with each other's works. So this was a gift in our own way of this collaboration. Zung's work there of the pickled houses, it's made out of resin that she made the jar from. It's typical of the working class community in Vietnam, where you would pickle fruits or vegetable. In this context, it's fruits where you serve as a drink, but it's in this amber solution of floating houses or homes. So what does that mean in this context? We have AP's work here called Twin Whispering, and it's a miniature landscape, and if you look closely, it's the artist with a soundtrack standing in front of a fictitious landscape. So this is a fake landscape within a fake landscape, which a lot of kids looked at because it's like this whole. And we have Min Man's work called Adore, and I understood it much more after seeing her performance this weekend at the London Gallery Weekend. And it's using scripture or calligraphy in the free-flowing text, and using heat, the bodily movement as a contemporary dancer, and changing this heat and energy and violence into something, a passion. So for me, it feels like the home as a painting in this context where you're regenerating one form of substance to another. We have Carol's photo albums. She responded to her French experience of the community in Paris, and so also there's one album during lockdown. She and other Vietnamese creatives went for walks, and that was a gift in itself of conversation and that experience. And then another one about the NViet archive that Carol did with Duong. And also my birthday cake. It's called Birth Cake to My Younger Self, and there are 7 candles, which is my first memory of having a birthday when I moved to Canada. There is deliberate queer aesthetics. There are nails and staples. It's inedible, of course. So these are the objects that we have used to denote our experience of home and our upbringing and our identity. I would like to start this question with Carol.
Dora.
Well,
we can start with Karen.
Dora, if you think particularly of the objects that some of the participants brought in, their photographs, how they responded to that, or their response of looking at things from the archive, to actually making basket weaves and using traditional material and recreating something.
Yeah, so I'd like to focus on the Living Object Archive workshop, because for that one we asked people to bring in objects of personal significance, and we left it quite open as to what people would bring in. And actually, I mean, a lot of the objects that were brought in had such moving stories behind them, and if you had looked at the objects without these stories that just look like everyday objects completely devoid of any meaning. And as I was saying before from the first question, a lot of these objects tend to be quite functional things, and I think that tells you a lot about the diaspora and about what has happened within these families. There was someone who brought in an outfit that she wore as a toddler when she first arrived as a refugee, and her parents had kept this outfit, and it was actually in mint condition. It was wonderful. It was this small cotton shirt, and that was just it was just a moment to pause when these stories come out, because it's I think it's incredible to have the person who holds the story and the person who authors that story in that moment and the physical object there. And that moment can never be recreated again. And then there was a trolley which someone brought in. It was just a really functional. I think it cost 50 cents when she bought it in the States, or her mother bought it for her in the States, because I think she was looking for a suitcase as she was moving at that point, and her Vietnamese mother said, "All you need is this," and it was just this folding metal trolley, and it was like it was like clackety and it was like, you know, half rusted, and it still is, but she still has it and she still uses it. And there's this kind of like, this is all we need to survive, like this kind of like narrative about it. And then it ranged to other things like karaoke systems, which nobody brought in a karaoke system, they just took a photograph of it. And like cooking utensils, like things that have been passed down. Like these are the things that get passed down, and they're like functional things that are like of practical use, that can lend themselves to the habits that create the home, and not necessarily like luxurious objects. So yeah, but those are some of the examples. Yeah.
Well, you said that you volunteered at some shelters and worked with some refugee people.
Yeah, I've done a lot of volunteering work. But in particular, I want to talk about some work I did with Cara a few years ago. I was invited to co-curate an exhibition on settlement with, it was at the Vietnamese Housing Association, and for those who don't know about this organisation, it was previously called the Annabelle Housing Association. And the reason why that kind of sprung up was when Vietnamese migrants were settled in the UK, so they would come to the UK, came to these RAF camps, Thorney Island, Derby Resettlement Centre, etc. They were then resettled right across the British Isles, so like Runcorn, Birmingham, Norwich, these types of places. And very quickly they realised they didn't want to live here, right? They didn't want to live in these places. Living in these places in the late 70s and 80s, it was slightly different to what it is today. Very different. And so they then decided to move back to the big metropolitan cities, so like Manchester, London, and AMVIT facilitated them. And so we took on the theme of settlement, and one of the things, Cara was one of the artists, and she organised these pinhole photography workshops where we got members of the community to come in. They were first generation, so it was also really nice because it was half term, so their children came, their grandchildren came, and we did these. If anybody's been to Cara's workshops, you do these like pinhole photography, like you make these cameras out of cardboard boxes. You have like photographic paper, lift it up, and then you can get a picture onto the photographic paper. But as part of that, because it's not instant, it's slow, because you have to go and develop it and it's come out. We had this series of questions where we asked people what home, settlement and identity meant. And I remember going around reading it. We translated it into Vietnamese as well, going around reading it, and I was getting quite frustrated, right? Because they listed things like everyday objects, like fridges, beds, TVs. I thought, I could have translated this wrong because I was explaining it as well. And I thought, this is total rubbish, I can't use this. But then when we kind of tease it out, we think of the journey they've taken. Right? Many of them would have traversed the seas and gone to different camps around Southeast Asia. So if I talk in the sense of my father, he left in 1980. He wasn't able to settle in his home in London until 1988. That's 8 years. 8 years is a very long time. 8 years where you're told you're not sure where you're going to sleep the next night. Right? You're not told where will you be. You're not allowed to buy things. You can't cook your own things. So in the context of Vietnamese migrants, having these very benign things, seemingly benign things, was incredibly powerful for them. And for me, this is my interpretation of it, because I had to go away and think about this, that it was the agency, it's the ability to go out and buy this. Like for such a long time, they didn't have this choice. They were always told what to do. Now they had a choice, and it was agency was the marker of home.
And we had a conversation last week about you working with homeless people and what objects did they?
Yeah. So I found parallels with homeless people as well. I remember very vividly having this heated conversation with a resident, and he was describing the homeless shelter as like a prison, right? Because they couldn't have kettles, they couldn't have microwaves, they couldn't have toasters in their bedroom. We have a kitchen that is catered for, we cook for them, but for this individual, he wanted these things in his room. And like health and safety regulation within charities are horrible, so you can't have them in the room. But for this individual, he wanted control, right? He wanted this agency, and you find this with people who've lost a lot, and they have very little. That they really cherish the small things.
It's just like during lockdown where you're told when you can and can't go out.
Yeah.
Annabelle, I know your recent research now is about objects and the art. Can you respond to objects and the meaning of home?
Sure, so okay, I think in a way this is probably more relevant to also talk a bit about some of the objects that people spoke about during my PhD research, because I feel like there's so many connections with what you were saying, Cường, about the importance of everyday objects and also what's been discussed about photographs. And I'm thinking just one example of a participant who was a refugee who left Vietnam by boat, and he could only bring very, very small objects. And one example was some family photographs, but they were just like passport-sized photographs of his parents, and that was one of the few things they'd been able to bring, and he had them blown up and put on his wall in his home, and they were one of the most important things that he cherished and talked about. And I found that, kind of things that people were able to bring had such a great meaning for them in the context of loss. Another example I found, particularly amongst younger people, was the way that traditional objects and the practices associated with them shifted in the context of migration. So a few younger people who had housed altars or shrines in their home, but for some of them, because they lived in quite transient housing, they didn't feel that they wanted to or were able to have maybe like a full example of an altar or shrine, so they used maybe different objects that still were very important in their spiritual practice or in their ancestor veneration, but they were different from what you might see in Vietnam, according to how they describe them to me. So I think that, any of these objects shouldn't be seen as static or unchangeable. They will definitely change in the context of migration, and that was something that came up a lot. In the context of the research I'm doing now, so one aspect of the project I'm working on is looking at how artists have represented the themes of home and migration. Artists often with migrant backgrounds, but sometimes artists of second or third generation who are, as this exhibition is kind of engaging with these questions about the uncertainty of home and the ambivalence of home. And I think one of the things we're trying to do is think about how narratives of home can sometimes be about belonging, but they can sometimes be about exclusion, and sometimes been used to exclude people, this kind of what Cường was talking about, this us and them kind of idea. So one of the things we're trying to do is think about how narratives of home how we can produce like counter narratives that are perhaps about maybe welcome or hospitality or inclusion, but even just kind of unsettling what we mean by who belongs, who doesn't belong. So we're looking at a whole range of exhibitions and artists who engage with those questions. But just in terms of this exhibition, I think that those connections between the material and tangible and intangible are coming through really strongly.
Even these white stools that were sat on, or the cushions.
Absolutely.
Hi, Owen.
Well, if I can pick up, I mean, I suppose we talked a bit about objects and what kind of objects we have in front of us, right? And they're objects that index some kind of exchange, right? They are objects that might be gifts, objects that might be shareable, objects that might be transmissible, things like the trolley that takes you from one place or the other. You know, look, I mean, you do see, and it's really interesting to me that there are so many, the kind of crossing point of the objects that are represented or attempted to find representation here are objects that can be shareable, as if, you know, the diasporic experience is one where something is transmitted, something is shared, something is exchanged. But in the art itself, you know, the durian can't be shared, it can't even be eaten. The birthday cake is made of resin. Like the bowls, there might be an indicator of something that it can be exchanged, but always in that effort of transmission, something gets blocked. And that's really what we see here, things that if food is a way in which something is exchanged, shared, bringing together a sense of community, some kind of cohesion, doesn't what these artworks show is that actually there's something that is lost, something that is inassimilable, something that doesn't quite work about that exchange.
On the subject of exchange, I want to talk about this conversation that we were having recently. I think Gung was saying how diasporic people are basically like glorified import-export agents. Whenever someone goes back to somewhere, there's always like an order list of like, oh, you need to get me this and give me this. And I think it's like amazing the level of granularity that can go to. Like, you need to get me this, but it has to be from there. It has to be from a specific place. It can't just be any version of it. And I think, I was just thinking about this quote by Edward Said, who's a post-colonial theorist. He talks about how, he talks about exiles specifically, but I think in this context, thinking about transnationalism, that when you cross borders, you also transcend barriers of thought and experience, and I think that is so true in the context of all these discussions, like the level of granularity you suddenly go into when you want this specific object from a specific place. That, you know, someone who has not necessarily experienced movement or migration or these complex notions of home may not, you know, ever have to think about. And I think the other aspect that's really interesting about the feeling of home is that I think because it's such an indefinable thing, it means that it can never be complete. And I've felt it myself where I found it like this unquenchable desire. Like I've gone on holiday to, for example, Hong Kong, where I never lived, but I still associate it with a feeling of home. And when I went there, I was just trying to consume everything. But like at the end of the day, it still was, it was a completely insatiable feeling. It just was unquenchable, and at the end I sort of came to this conclusion that, well, how can you ever complete something if it's just this shapeless, formless thing? Yeah.
There's something about an effort of transmission there, isn't it? Where something might not be transmissible, like a language or like a cultural experience that's been erased or is lost in the sands of time. And in its place will come maybe objects like these that can't be shared, that can't be exchanged, or relatively worthless objects that are in a series that are always exchanged, like the cigarettes, like the small trinkets, like the things that, you know, are passed down, passed forward, as if that transmission has to be carried on, and it doesn't necessarily matter with what. So it's less that the object itself is important than the act of exchange, the act of gift giving, the act of transmission. It doesn't necessarily matter what it is. And this is why, you know, you sometimes find old people in perhaps an effort to kind of preserve something of their own lives, their own memory, to create some kind of lineage, will pass down relatively worthless things to generation. It just matters that things are transmitted. If they can't be done in one register, they're done in another.
And we're so far speaking about objects as physical things, but I forgot to mention Gung's piece of the sound, and if anyone's ever been to Asia, you can be indoors and it could still be so loud. So in the context of this exhibition, we turned off the sound for the panel discussions, but you're hearing the noise, and it's when you land in Asia, you know that you're in Asia, not just from the heat, but from the sound that you hear, and that for me feels like home. You know, when I went to China for the first time, I felt so out of place. I thought maybe this is like the Amy Tan story where you feel at home. But when I went back to Vietnam as a foreign tourist, it felt more at ease, even though I didn't quite understand the language, but the food, the culture, the people. And now, progressively, because I've been here for 13 years, when I go back to Toronto, my family is there, but I feel like that's home, but the city has changed so much. So we're always in this dilemma of where home is. Would you like to ask each other any questions during this conversation? Let's open up the dialogue to the audience, and if I can ask you to project your voice because we're recording. Yes, Maya.
I wanted to respond to what you said, Owen, when you said that this object can't be shared. I think it's the opposite, because they're art, they are even more shareable and can be transcending and filling the gaps and the failures of sharing. Maybe from an artistic point of view, I don't see it as from your perspective. I think I've never shared a Dorian with anybody yet, or if I might share it, that was important. Maybe it would be rotten by the time you arrive, or maybe the right taste that they expect. But that's the whole point of this beautiful show, I think, is that it transcends and gives cohesion to all the different types of experience as Vietnamese or wherever we're from.
Whenever there's I think whenever there's an impossibility for something like, let's say more abstract, like a cultural experience to be shared, there's still an effort to reflect that impossibility somehow, and perhaps the abstraction of some works of art show that impossibility, but the fact of its creation itself shows that effort is still necessary to be made.
Yeah.
At the end of the exhibition, we're going to crack a door and open here. Yes, Susan.
Yeah, I was just saying, just following on that, because that was beautiful. And for me, it's a lot about that abstraction yields space for association. And that association can be from all different places. It can be from a specificity of a place, of a thing, an activity, the shape of it, the smell of it, whatever. But I think that's one of the biggest things is how, and I think that's where art is fantastic, when it has that capacity to associate not only in the specific, but allow that kind of expansive association so that others can come in and have a sensation for themselves. That may be different from that original narrative, perhaps, but that's kind of, I believe, what we desire. Yeah.
There's, I have to admit, there's times where I haven't told KV this, I would sometimes ignore his messages because I was under so much pressure, and we were working with loads of really incredibly established artists, and I felt a sense of like, okay, I've not done enough. So I have nothing to reply to KV's messages.
I knew you were ignoring me.
And talking about Susan's talking about association and how things can change, right, to what you've conceived of. And over time, so going back to about ignoring KV, one of the things I had to kind of accept was once you publish work or produce work and you let it go, it takes on a life of its own. You just have to let it go. Sometimes you would never finish the work, and that's fine, right? And that took me a long time in this process to say that. And talking about how you can see things, over time, with this piece of work, people have come to me and shared their observations about it, and it's changed how I think about it, and that's shifted as well. And so, I think you were talking about this, right? And it's also how people can interpret work that can also change, and that speaks to some of the subjects that we spoke about that are quite abstract. That things do shift over time, even these physical objects.
Yes.
In your research and interrogation into these notions of like homemaking, as pertaining to especially objects and experiences, did you also look into people's journey with mental health and mental well-being? Because I found from a personal experience that as I've gotten older and worked a lot on myself in terms of mental health and also sort of making my home, my body, my home, that I'm very happy to sort of live in and be in, that I don't have to negotiate those tensions anymore. In fact, those tensions have kind of dissipated, and it's been very relieving for me.
Who would like to respond? I guess I can say that we haven't touched upon this, but there are so many undocumented workers here. And even the sense of not having papers to not know where you might get kicked out, that your stability is shaken, and that I guess is a trigger of a lot of anxiety into mental health illness as well.
I think, I was just going to highlight the work of the Vietnamese mental health service, which sadly I recently found out is no longer going to be continuing, but they did a huge amount of work supporting people with a culturally sensitive perspective, so employing bilingual counsellors and workers, and just think having that unique perspective that can't be replicated in mainstream services. I think it's a huge loss that it's no longer going to be with us, but I think maybe that's one example of actually a refugee-led perspective, refugee-led organisation that was helping people to cope with long-standing trauma in many cases. But I didn't address the topic of mental health specifically in the research I was doing, but certainly that sense of uncertainty that comes with maybe precarious living and experiences of not knowing your future home, that was something that came up a lot online.
I wonder if, sorry, you go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's in terms of mental health in the ambit archives and some of the research that I came across, one of the demographics that suffer the most are fathers, especially first generation fathers. They move from inherently a very patriarchal society to a less patriarchal society. I think Britain is still very patriarchal, and the roles within the family really shift. And I think Jack Shear talked about this, the director of mental health. He said that what happens is suddenly they are no longer, they're still in some ways decision makers, but yet they have to rely very heavily on their children to translate, to take them to appointments, to explain things to them. So they lose a lot of agency in that sense, and children gain a lot. Mothers tend to gain a lot of, they tend to flourish. They take jobs on, they still carry on care duties and domestic duties, and their roles completely shift. Whereas fathers, especially first generation migrants, really tend to suffer, and they have high levels of mental health issues. And that's really not been addressed, I think. So one of the unspoken things within first generation Vietnamese migrants is high use of heroin, high use of other substances like alcohol and other narcotics. that's something that I don't think I came across, and I don't think I've really covered it, but that's one thing that I did see, and I just wanted to share it with the people in the room today.
I wonder if Owen can share your experience with some of the analysts that you see, not specific about the Vietnamese experience, but people with mental health illness, what their concept of home and what is important for them.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to say anything that's kind of general about that, and you know, sometimes people find great solace in being able to express themselves in terms that link them to a community or to a general experience. You know, people might find it very helpful to have a diagnosis of a disorder or a disturbance that enables them to have some kind of certainty about how they proceed. I think that what the question for psychoanalysis is always, what is the function of that? Like, what is it bringing them? Is it bringing them a sense of identity? Is it bringing them a different kind of experience of their body? Is it allowing certain things to become possible or not? But I think, you know, the position for a psychoanalyst, it has to be one of complete modesty, of not knowing, you know, it is a listening profession, and what you're listening for is obviously the words that someone is saying and the idioms of distress, because that's one of the things that can be very culturally specific. It's very specific to everyone anyway, but the way in which distress is expressed, and I suppose by contrast to that, the way in which people get by, the kind of restitution mechanisms that people have that they find for themselves. And I think that that's always very interesting about people, just what it is that might have brought them to a moment of crisis where those idioms of distress become too much, how they're expressed, the extent to which they might be malleable or changeable, and the ways in which they've got by, the ways in which they've found a solution for themselves that might hold their world together. It's difficult to talk in general terms about mental health, I suppose, because there really isn't any such thing. There's just many, many different ways in which people survive.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
Not a question specifically, but I wonder if any of you could comment on how trauma is sort of transmitted intergenerationally. And I'm curious, I guess, if people could talk about their experiences of received trauma, particularly if you were born and raised in a Western country, how your parents and grandparents' experiences, how you experience that.
Who would like to start?
A little bit.
I think, you know, my dad has such a sour taste of Vietnam because we were on the losing side, and I would ask if he wanted to come on holiday to visit his country, and he said no, he'd rather go back to China. So there's this association of a past from 35 years ago, and it's still ingrained in his mind. I wonder if Owen can speak about intergenerational trauma, not specific to Vietnamese people, but just overall how we perceive that.
Yeah, I think it's very tempting to look at the kind of the big traumas, you know, like war and these kind of overarching narratives, and most of the research, you know, the traumatology type research on generational transmission has been done looking at Holocaust survivors and people like that. I think you've got to look really at the way in which these experiences are metabolized, and they might be in incredibly discrete ways. One of the things that people found when they were looking at Holocaust survivors is that, you know, while the children of Holocaust survivors would go and see shrinks and they'd go and see psychotherapists complaining of mental health problems, the survivors themselves would often go to doctors, physicians of the body, because their complaint wouldn't, or their experience, their trauma, would be metabolized not at the level of words, not at the level of questions about, you know, what anxiety perhaps, but at the level of the body, right? So that again, there's, you know, back to this idea of something being unassimilable. you have to look for the very small discrete details, and those occur in several ways. Sometimes the shared experience of a loss is quite permanent between generations. So a loss in a family of the first generation might be echoed in a later generation, and it's only at that point of echoing in that later generation that in a kind of reverse way we reactualize or reinvest the experience of the previous generation. It takes on an additional significance. Experiences of debt, some kind of loss that is not only doubled but is kind of materialized, perhaps as a financial debt, perhaps as an experience of something being owed to someone, which is something very transmissible through generations. These kind of things persist, and the difficult thing is where you don't have something that can be spoken about, where it can't be put into words. Very often it's put into another register of images, or directly onto the body. People's bodies remember, the body keeps the score, as people say, rather than the memory itself.
I think in my experience working with East and Southeast Asia groups, is that, and if I'm allowed to generalise, that trauma becomes like a barrier for communication, and so then how do you address trauma if communication can't happen? Which is, I think, why it's so important to have culturally specific mental health programs. But speaking from experience my own and people I've worked with, so many people have said, like, you know, it's impossible to engage with my dad or my grandfather or whoever in trying to speak to them about the past. I just want to know more, but it's really difficult. And the communication barriers are always language. Trauma is always there as well. Like, there's this within East and Southeast Asian communities, I think that there is this general neglection of the past, and I think that is complicated by ideas of poverty and politics. There is this kind of resistance to revisiting that, which is completely understandable. So then, what does that mean? It means that, and also there can be ideas of shame in seeking out help, which is also another layer of complexity. So then, sometimes it's left to this, you know, there's usually, you know, at least one person in the family who's like, well, I want to find out more, and then it's kind of, then whatever role you are in that family, you know, you also take on the role of an archivist in a way, because you think, I'm the only one who can do this, because no one else from outside the family is going to be able to mine these stories. And so it has to be done so sensitively. And those are the things that always come up in my work.
That's me and the family.
Can I offer something as well? Because I work in the mental health field. I'm a psychologist and I am from Chinese, Vietnamese background. And I think it's really interesting because a lot of how we see things here is from a Western lens. And actually, I think trauma is also seen through a Western lens in terms of diagnosis and locating the problem in a person. And actually, what I would invite is just a really radical way of perceiving mental health, and actually what we term intergenerational trauma. But actually, a lot of the stories are of hope. So it's actually weaving in stories of intergenerational hope, where in the Western lens it may be seen as trauma, but actually her families, actually they have made a choice to leave for something better, and actually there's a courage in that, there's hope. And you know, I also believe what we focus on, we get more of as well. And there was something in, you know, Duong, we did the workshop, and it's about how the Vietnamese refugees are viewed in the press, in the media, and the internet, and actually it's always positioned as the victim, and I think that's, mental health can do that as well in the field, and how can we, as a collective, view it through a different lens, you know, from the community lens, because actually, I think it's really interesting as well, because in Southeast Asian culture and in philosophy, it's very much in the present. There's not a past, there's not a future. And I think for a lot of people, because we're seeing it through a a different lens, we're seeing it as a trauma. But actually, for a lot of people, I think for the old generation, they very much live in that mindful, it's now, so it's gone now, we don't need to think about that. But we keep going, drudging up the past because of the lens that we have now. Actually, they're very resilient in that, I think, and there's a lot to learn from that generation as well.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
I had a question, I guess particularly for Dora and Cường, but anyone else in the room who is working in the museum context. I guess just that this exhibition is taking place in a museum at a home, and the museum has undergone a lot of change in recent years, but there's still kind of difficult politics around it that is being grappled with. And I guess my question is, what can museums do to support this questioning of home in the context of migration, and maybe what are some of the limits of it, and how might we start, how can we maybe try to overcome the challenges of it?
I think this is actually a good opportunity for me to thank Lara and Anna. I mean, working with, I think as a team, we're quite fortunate that Lara and Anna has to deal with a lot of the institutional BS, right? And they filter that out before it comes to us. And also having two people who have come from similar backgrounds, who live in diaspora context, they're both creators, and they're critiquing the ideas and the situations and the themes that we're living with. I can totally trust what I say to them, right? I can come to them with my ideas and my concerns and the issues that I want to address without having to filter it, without having to water it down, or being at fear of being tokenized, or being, recently I had to send an email to somebody who wanted to work with me, and I said, I want to be considered somebody with a decision-making role, and I want the pay to reflect that, and the contract to reflect that, and I want the recognition to come with that, rather than being a source of knowledge to be pulled upon when needed and to be discarded when no longer needed. Whereas with Anna and Lara, I didn't feel that way, right? Because they understand what context I'm working in, because they themselves are creators. So museums need to hire more people like Anna and Lara.
I think within our narrative of East and Southeast Asia, it's really important to have people who work in the institution who understand our narrative and who can feel our narrative in order for us to deliver this program. We're working towards against the Western dominant narrative here, so there's a lot to negotiate with that. So we're very pleased and privileged to have this platform, not just for the Vietnamese diaspora, but for the wider community as well.
Yeah, it's been transformative actually working with Anna and Lara, so I just wanted to say that again. But also that we can be critical together, which is like really important. I think just embedding yourself within a community with people that you can just be critical with. I think that is what's most important. I came across the British and Chinese exhibition at the British Museum, British Library, which was on recently, and I came away from it with a lot of thoughts. I won't share them here. And what astounded me is that, how can the people who curated this and who contributed to it, who decided it should be on, there was no critical narrative of it after it happened. And there is actually a lot to be critical about in terms of the content and how it was put together and what was in it and the narratives. And so I think that's probably because they probably have a lack of representation within that institution, and that the curators are not actually embedded in the community. There's probably a bunch of other reasons as well. I think the funding was probably very limited for that project, which showed. And of course there are all these challenges. So I think it's important to have that critical narrative, because we're currently at this stage where diaspora art, unfortunately, I think it often exists in this bubble, in this critical vacuum, where because everyone's so excited that this work exists and it's out there, that people are forgetting to critique it, which is really unhealthy. Actually, we need to do that now, like, while it's happening. So, yeah.
I think, thank you very much to the panelists and the audience for being here with us. Stay where you are. Wave, everyone. Welcome to our home.